The scientific revolution starts now.
The Philosopher podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
My background is I'm a philosopher. Did a philosophy degree, philosophy masters, philosophy PhD, and during that time I uploaded videos to YouTube. The thing that actually started me off uploading videos to YouTube was it was entirely self-interested. I found that it was a lot easier to learn stuff if I tried to teach it to other people. So, like in the course of learning philosophy, I just started making these videos more just for my own sake, just because I like what I found that like teaching it to other people got it into my head. So that was how it all started. And I've been doing that for I think over a decade now. So yeah, that's who I am. And as for the sort of forces that drive me now, I mean that's very difficult to say. I'm not really somebody who thinks very much about my own mind. Maybe that's an odd thing for a philosopher to say, but I'm not very reflective about what my motivations are. I just happen to really love this subject, and so I'll come across questions or ideas that interest me. I'm like, hey, I want to explore that a bit more, and that's what I do. And then sometimes I make videos out of it, and I guess I've built up a bit of an audience that way. So that's me.
Are there a lot of problems still left? This is kind of a stupid question, forgive me, but are there a lot of problems left in philosophy? Because it seems like after a couple thousand years, people would have essentially figured out the tools of logic necessary to reconstruct reason and decision making and the various things philosophy tackles. So what are the frontiers?
I think that most central philosophical questions are still unresolved. I don't think there's really much progress in philosophy. So most of the kind of like the big questions, the big things that people were asking 2,000 years ago, we're still asking today. And I mean, if there is progress, I think the progress would consist in things like, we now have a much more sophisticated understanding of things like formal logic. We also have maybe more precise concepts. We have like more tools, perhaps, for dealing with these questions. But yeah, I mean, I don't really think that philosophy ever really progresses. So I would say that, like, yeah, like all of the pretty much all of the philosophical questions are still, in some sense, frontier questions. The question that I'm interested in the most would probably be something like, like what is the sort of scope of our knowledge of the world, or something like that. That was a question that people were asking 2,000 years ago. There's one like way that you can look at the history of philosophy, which I think is mistaken. So sometimes there's this view that like philosophy is like an incubator for the sciences. So there's this idea that, well, there are some questions that we sort of don't know how to answer empirically, and philosophers maybe play some sort of role in nailing down the conceptual foundations of those questions, and then once you've done that, they become open to empirical inquiry, and then they just sort of become a science. So there were philosophers 2,000 years ago talking about the nature of space and time, and there are still philosophers who talk about space and time today. But really, if you want to figure out what space and time are, you would look at the sciences, you'd look at physics. But in fact, I think that really what's happened is more just that there's a kind of increasing specialization. So 2,000 years ago, there wasn't really a distinction drawn between, the philosopher and the scientist, or the philosopher and the physicist. Whereas now we do draw that distinction. We like everybody's become hyper specialized. So the the philosophical questions about the nature of space and time, say, I think are still unresolved. And I suspect they probably will remain unresolved forever. I'm kind of pessimistic about philosophy in that respect. I don't really think we're ever going to answer these philosophical questions. At least we're not going to answer them in a way that achieves consensus on them. Let's put it that way.
I mean, that's a really interesting gap between physics and philosophy. I've found myself fallen down into that chasm before, where I'll try to...
Pushed into that chasm?
Tripped and fell deep into that chasm. I mean, one of the big projects we do here, not at this channel, but at a different channel, is we try to give material form to quantum mechanics. So we take the mathematics of quantum mechanics and we try to imagine what sort of material representation those things could have. And when I first started writing about those things, I would go to, different forums for physics and try to post it, and they would kick me out and say, this is philosophy. Then I'd go to the philosophy forum, try to post it, they'd kick me out and tell me I should be in the physics forum. And it happened again and again and again, and I realized there's just this no man's land between the two, where people didn't want to take responsibility for that crossover. It's really fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it's just inevitable that as inquiry proceeds, you sort of solve some problems here and there. You kind of solve the low-hanging fruit, and then in order to deal with the harder problems, you just have to specialize. And so maybe this is just a kind of inevitable feature of the nature of knowledge, that people become more and more and more specialized, and then one of the unfortunate consequences of that is that it becomes harder and harder to hold dialogues between these different sort of research traditions. I mean, I don't really know how to solve that problem, but that seems to be the way things are.
Yeah, how to stitch them together. It's one of the things we also play with is what a better version of the academy would look like. What a better version of how we acquire, consolidate knowledge and teach it, pass it on, what that would look like. And it seems like there is increasingly less room for generalists. That's obviously kind of what forced us out. I mean, we still teach at the university, but we don't do research because we didn't want to be stuck studying some tiny little minutia for the rest of our lives. Respect to people who do that for sure, but it just isn't appealing. And so there isn't totally a home for this interdepartmental crosstalk to be a real powerful voice in the conversation. And there's not people who are able to do that explicitly, which is kind of tragic. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that kind of worries me is, so this worries me because I suppose I'm something of I'm kind of occupying this kind of generalist space as well. I mean, at least with respect to philosophy. I mean, philosophy has also become hyper specialized, to the extent that you can have somebody who is, say, working in epistemology, or there may be working in I don't know, general epistemology, and then somebody else working in applied epistemology. They might not have much to talk about with each other, that's how specialized it's become. And one of the things that concerns me is just, well, if you're going to be a generalist, if you're going to take on that generalist role, it looks like you're going to have an understanding of at least some of these different specializations. But since everything's becoming hyper specialized, and since it's incredibly difficult to get a deep understanding of each of these specializations, that might just mean that, just necessarily as a generalist, you're just not really going to know what it is you're talking about. And you see what I mean? That's a concern that I have. So, and again, I don't really know how to resolve that, but
So, as a generalist, I think that the answer to that question is to find pieces that are in use by all of the different branches and then figure out how to contribute to an understanding of those pieces that spans multiple disciplines. Because I think about this all the time. We've explored the question of consciousness on the show a lot. And something that I very quickly realized is that I don't think that any two people mean the same thing when they use the word consciousness. There's literally not a consensus in the literature. You can use various adjectives to specify what kind of consciousness and what exactly you mean by that. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to talk to somebody for an hour before you start to realize that the reason that you can't get anywhere is because the definitions that you're using are completely orthogonal to one another. Okay. So in that world, I think that what the generalist does is the generalist basically goes into places and tidies up. Like you spend enough time looking at stuff and you're like, that doesn't fit there. That doesn't fit there. And if you rearrange this room of your mind like this, then all of a sudden these things fit together and good luck. And then you walk away and you go do that to somebody's place. I don't know if that resonates with you.
No, that's I suppose it's probably like that's probably something like the sort of approach that I mean that seems to make some sense. I mean, I guess it's like when we think about like these different concepts, and so in the case of consciousness, we have all of these different concepts of consciousness, and we can like apply these different concepts. So there are different problems, right? Like when we're talking about consciousness, I mean, if you talk to somebody like, David Chalmers, a philosopher, the kind of problems that he's talking about are going to be quite different to the kind of problems that motivate somebody who's, studying, like I don't know, a species of worm or something. And then you're asking about like sentience in that species of worm. And I don't know. I mean, I still have this worry that like, in order to say like anything useful about either of these cases, I would need to deeply understand the problems and what motivates these different concepts, and sort of I'd need to know how those concepts work within the respective theories. So there just seems to be like so much, but ultimately, I mean, I guess you can only do your best, and it's probably worthwhile to have some people trying to draw connections between these different areas. So yeah.
I mean, I get where you're coming from, because there is this, I don't want to say fear, but there is a concern that when you wander into a field where there's a lot of scholarship, that there's something that if you miss it, the resulting synthesis that you make will be completely off base at best and actually upsetting to people at worst. And so I think that definitely is a problem of going into these spaces where people put a great value on being familiar with the body of literature. But I also think that there's something to be said about understanding from this 30,000 foot view, because we live in a time where there's so much text and there's so many ideas. And I think that part of the reason that there's so much text is that people don't know how to simplify their ideas to the core of them. Right? Because a philosophical text is, in its bulk, kind of it's an argument. It's a treatise that tells you some fact about nature, about the world, about yourself, and then spends an inordinate amount of time and resources trying to convince you that this is the case. Right? It's not like every sentence contains something revelatory. In many cases, it's just the iterative process of proving the point. And so I feel like we could all benefit from being able to digest David Chalmers' ideas into a couple sentences. And being like, obviously, this doesn't encompass the full complexity, but this is basically what you're saying. And if this is basically what you're saying, then we can work with it and start to do more, right? We turn something that's huge, a body of work, into a building block for something else. Like you have to transform scale almost, because everybody has one or two good ideas, and those ideas can be condensed. Sure.
I mean, actually, I mean, this is certainly the case in philosophy. I know from personal experience that you can write like an article, and it might really require something like 2,000 words to actually express what you need to express. But then in the process of getting it published, there's people who are going to kind of pick apart lots and lots of different things, and you just have to add more and more content to deal with these somewhat pedantic, somewhat pedantic objections. And so it ends up ballooning into a much more, a much denser and longer piece of material. So, yeah, I mean, part of it, I think, is there's a lot of content that doesn't last, and that probably is not really that important.
Not only just the content, because I mean, let's say that the whole body of ideas is valuable, because I think about this in an architectural way where each idea is a building block that you can use for constructing the new way that you see the world. Because you said something interesting at the beginning where you said that the questions that we ask are still being asked 2,000 years later. What changes is our relationship to those questions and the way that we answer them. And it seems like the previous generation of philosophical thinking that we draw from in order to answer those questions are the building blocks for the next set of answers, because you know that you're never going to get to an end where you have an answer, and that's just what you now think until the heat death of the universe.
Yes, although sometimes we end up just throwing out all of the previous building blocks and trying something completely different. So at least in philosophy, I think there's not even a tendency in the long period to sort of build anything significant. But I don't know, maybe I'm too pessimistic about it.
I mean, it almost seems like it's an exercise discipline. Like the art of asking these questions is what is valuable, and the knowledge that's gained about how to attack these questions is then applied perhaps to other areas of intellectual pursuit or daily life even. Like, people, like if an alien were to land on the planet and see somebody running, like going jogging in the morning, they'd be like, "Where are you trying to get to so fast?" And the person's like, no, I'm not going anywhere. And they're like, "Well, what the hell? Like, what do you mean?" But I think the same thing might be true in something like philosophy as well, where you are working out and you are developing muscles for these different methods, but you're not necessarily fixated on any particular solution that becomes consensus or something like that. I don't know. What do you think?
Right, yeah. Well, I mean, look, my view on this is that I think that human beings in general just seem to have a kind of curiosity, and that includes a curiosity about what we might think of as philosophical questions. So, I mean, I think that a lot of people have wondered, for instance, whether they like maybe I'm in the Matrix, or like maybe I'm a brain in a vat. So that kind of skeptical question, for instance, that's a purely philosophical question. I don't think you're really going to.
Where do you fall on that, by the way?
Sorry?
Where do you fall on that, by the way? Matrix, brain and vat, yes or no?
Well, I'm very, very sympathetic to skepticism, but my sort of take is that I will adopt and drop beliefs on the basis of whatever is practically useful in a given context. So there are certain situations where I find it very useful to run through skeptical arguments and give up my belief in the common sense external world. So if I'm like in a social situation, I'm quite introverted. So if there's a big crowd, lots of people, I'm meeting new people, I might just sort of sit and think to myself, okay, how can I prove that I'm not a brain in a vat? I mean, not just prove, but like, is there any evidence at all? Is there even the slightest evidence that I'm not a brain in a vat? Is there even the slightest evidence that this isn't just a massive hallucination?
The Demystify Sci podcast is a labor of love, but that does not mean that it is a labor of love with no overhead. And so we need your help to keep the podcast going. If you have a couple dollars a month that you can spare, you should come right on over to patreon.com/demystifysci and sign up to donate a couple dollars a month. In return, you get episodes early every week. You get to join our community of patrons that hang out every Sunday to talk about new ideas in science, where they want to see the show going, things that they've encountered during the week that they were curious about and want to put in front of the group. And you get to support the project. You get to help us grow and become stronger and better at what we do. If you don't have any money right now, that is totally fine. What you can do is you can harness the power of word of mouth. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors, find some friends' phone and subscribe them to the Demystify Sci podcast so that they get updates when we put out new episodes, and make sure that our name is on people's lips, because through the grapevine is the way that we grow. If you've already done that and you're still casting about for how to help, you can just come and join our community. We have a Facebook group and we have a Discord server, so come by, hang out, meet some people, share your ideas. In the meantime, back to our conversation with Kane Baker.
No, there isn't. So, so I sort of just give up that belief, and I can, treat life like a kind of game, and that's very useful in that context. But then there are some situations where it's very nice to have a sense of connection to other people. Like if you're in a romantic relationship, for instance, you don't just want to think that the person you're interacting with is literally an NPC, right? Like you want that to be another mind that you have some sort of connection with. And so in that situation, I just kind of forget all of the skeptical stuff, and I embrace the common sense view of the world. So I think that we can kind of make commitments and choose beliefs. Of course, that's not, you can't just sort of choose to believe anything, right? I mean, if you said to me, okay, Kane, I'll give you, £100 if you can just choose to believe that there's really an elephant in the room with you right now. I can't do that. I can, like,
could you do it for £1 million though?
I couldn't do it for $1 million either. Like, it's just, there's just not an elephant here. I look at the room and I don't see an elephant. But in the case of these sorts of skeptical arguments, I mean, the point is that all of my experiences really are, they really are accommodated by the hypothesis that I'm a brain in a vat, by the hypothesis that this is all just a dream, by the hypothesis that I'm in the Matrix. I mean, there's loads of these like skeptical hypotheses that actually just fit my experiences perfectly well. So in that case, yeah, I mean, I can kind of adopt and drop beliefs kind of at will, and that's what I do. So I would say that I'm a kind of voluntarist about this, right? Like I will hold different beliefs in different contexts. My sort of official position here is that I don't think there's a convincing solution to any of these skeptical arguments, or at least maybe I shouldn't say any. There's no convincing solution to many skeptical arguments. So the argument, for example, if you don't know you're not a brain in a vat, you don't know that you have hands. You don't know you're not a brain in a vat, so you don't know you have hands. That kind of skeptical argument just seems unassailable to me. I don't think there's a convincing solution to that. So yeah, I mean, maybe none of this is real. I don't think there's any way of ruling that out. And of course, that's an example of one of these philosophical questions that we've had for thousands of years, and that nobody has really made any progress in answering. I mean, lots of people think that they've made progress, but I don't think that there has been really.
Well, something like that. Like the strange thing for me with that position has always been that it doesn't seem to be an actionable belief. Like that, I don't know that believing in that really does anything for you in the world. Like at the end of the day, even if this is all a simulation, I still have consequences for my actions. If I step out in front of a city bus, that's the end of my game. And so it doesn't seem to be like separable in terms of changing the way that I would act in the world, which has always kind of turned me off to it.
That you know of, right? Because you can easily, if it is a video game, you can just respawn after you get hit by the bus. And you don't know.
But if you get it right, maybe you don't have to. I don't know.
But I think that's why it's such a. This is what Neil and us are always arguing about, right? We have a very materialist perspective that we take on the atomics side of things.
For physics.
For physics, right? So we're like, look, physics should probably supervene on something physical. We should talk about what that physical thing is because it will help us understand more about nature if we can think about things in terms of bodies, because that tends to be what we understand the best and the easiest. Okay. But at the same point, you are confronted by the fact that it is kind of an unanswerable question if this is real or not. Because the rules inside the simulation that govern the action of bodies are just rules inside the simulation that govern the actions of bodies. You can do everything that we're doing and still have it be inside of a reality that isn't real. But there
what
has
does
to
it
be,
give you, I guess?
what does it give you? Angst?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Does it cause angst for you? The idea that your brain in a vat? Or could be?
I mean, I would agree with the point that, like, even if this is just a dream or simulation or something, there still seems to be these regularities, and those regularities I can kind of I can be better or worse at latching on to regularities in a way that promotes my interests, and science seems to be a very, very effective tool for latching on to regularities. But I do think that it makes a practical difference, because I mean I would just appeal to my own experience here, right? Like, I think that reflecting on these skeptical scenarios has been a very useful tool for alleviating anxiety. So when it comes to situations which might prompt social anxiety, if you really embrace skepticism, I think that the anxiety has less of a grip on you, or at least that's the case for me. I mean, it's like this. Right? I don't know if either of you have ever had a lucid dream. Is that when you realize you're dreaming? Yeah. So I've had lucid dreams occasionally, and there have been situations where I've had dreams where things have been happening that have been, quite scary or unpleasant. But then I realize I'm dreaming, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, it just doesn't matter then, like it's fine, like I'm okay with this. And something similar, I think, can happen when you embrace skepticism. But it has costs as well, because if you think that there's just no reason at all to believe that the world is as it seems to be, if you think there's no reason to believe that there really are other people that you're interacting with, then that can be very lonely. So that's why I'm not a skeptic all the time. Sometimes I'll embrace skepticism, sometimes I'll embrace belief in the external world. But I do that on the basis of the whether or not it makes me feel good to do it. So there's a practical difference. Now, I can't say that this would work for everybody. I mean, like, some people just might not be responsive to this in the way that I am. But for me, at least, there is some practical payoff.
Well, what's interesting is that I totally agree with the personal use of it and the ability to choose between different perspectives based on the circumstances to tune your own emotional reactivity to a situation. Like, I think that resonates very, very deeply. What's weird is that this kind of, you've been using the word skepticism. Am I correct to take it that you mean skepticism about reality being real?
Yeah, so I mean skepticism about whether or not the common sense view of the world is right. So, like, are there really other people? Are there really trees and fields and hands and things like that? Or is this just a dream? Is it just a simulation? And the skeptic will say that, well, we just have no idea, right? There's no good reason to believe that the world is as it seems to be.
Well, what's weird is that, hold on, let me finish this thought and then take it. This seems to have turned into a field of scientific study. Where were you going to
go? Yeah, what about that?
Well, you have the simulationists, right? You have the Max Tegmarkians of our mathematical universe, where he plainly lays out that he believes that our world is not shaped by math, it is math. And the only possible development of that is a scientific study of simulation theory, because where do the algorithms come from? They can come from nothing else except for the simulation that we're in.
I think, in some ways, I feel like for quite a long time, science has had, there's this kind of weird tension where, like, on the one hand, scientific theories are obviously based on what we experience. They're based on the appearances, because any scientific theory ultimately has to be tested against observation. Presumably, right? Like that's a fairly common view of, like, ultimately the basis of all of science is, well, we have a theory, it entails some sort of prediction or observation, and then we go out and we see whether that prediction is correct. So it's based on observation. But at the same time, the actual content of these theories very often, like, undermines our ability to trust the appearances. So, in one example of this would be something like how it appears to be the case that colors are intrinsic properties of the surfaces of objects. It seems pretty clear that that doesn't work. There's not many people who still defend the idea that colors are, like, literally just properties of the object's surfaces. And maybe it's the case that color is just a kind of massive illusion. But then that's very interesting, because if you think about how you have any kind of visual access to the external world, well, it's through color differences, right? Ultimately, what I'm seeing right now is just patterns of color, and so, yeah, this sort of this tension between, like, okay, this theory is kind of based on what I'm experiencing, but at the same time, it seems to undermine parts of, and it undermines my trust in parts of my experience, is something that crops up quite a lot in scientific theorizing. The one thing I would say, though, is that I think if you're endorsing a specific scientific theory, then I wouldn't really see that as being a kind of skepticism. So, like, ultimately, maybe you are convinced by, Max Tegmark's mathematical universe hypothesis, or maybe you're convinced by something like the simulation argument. You think that there, is good reason to believe that we are in fact in a simulation. I wouldn't see that as a kind of skepticism, because I take it that the skeptic just wants to say, like, the skeptical position is an agnostic position. The skeptic is going to say, we just have no idea, right? Like, the way things really are. Whereas, if you're saying that we have good reason to believe that this really is a simulation, then, well, you do think that you know how things really are. It's just that our experiences are misleading with respect to the way that things really are.
There's an interesting difference between a dream and reality, which is the surrealism, and how in reality things are just logically tied to one another. Like, if I put my hand on a hot burner, I'm going to burn my hand. It just seems like it's a pretty cut and dry difference. Like, if I was in a dream right now, maybe my hands would turn into spaghetti or something, and that would seem perfectly normal to me at the time.
Cacio and pepe for dinner.
Exactly. But there's something specific about this world that has pretty simple rules to it, and there seems to be a material basis to which we interact. Like, I have to actually move my body if I want to go in the other room, and so, yeah, I guess I just don't see.
Yeah, I guess, like, in a dream, I feel like there's such a limited sphere of things that can happen at the same time, right? There feels like there's a limited amount of things that the brain can process, and the way that my dream world works is that there's almost this bubble of the observable universe. And you can get to the edge of that bubble and you can step through it. And that's why you end up in these different universes inside of dreams, right? You open a door and all of a sudden you're somewhere totally different from where you were before. And there's this gradual shift from place to place that's very non-real, which is what Shiloh's pointing to. And so I look at the complexity of the observable universe and the size of it and the permanence of it, where in a dream, I see the moon and I contemplate it and then I look away. And when I look back, it's a giraffe. There's not a moon there. But yet every single day I can go and I can look at the moon and it has this predictable cycle and there's not, like you're saying, there's this sense of reality.
It's just like you can apply science to the real world because everything should have an expected cause for its effect. And we can tease that out.
Like, I feel like quantum physics is what gives people the
ammunition
license. I was going to say, the license, the ammunition to start talking about the fact that reality isn't real, right? Because if you didn't have quantum physics, would you still have this? Does this crop up 2,000 years ago before quantum physics?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. I mean, these sorts of skeptical problems have been with us a long time. So a couple of points on the dream thing. Interestingly, my dreams are quite dull in comparison to what you're describing. But my dreams, I mean, at least as far as I recall, are fairly stable. I mean, actually, so the times when I've had lucid dreams, I've always been struck by just how real and stable they seem. So like I've had dreams where I've become aware that I'm dreaming. So I have a very good memory for this. And I remember like walking out of my door, except I didn't walk out the door. I didn't open the door. I literally just walked through the door. I was like, oh, this is a dream. So I'm going to walk through my door. So I walked through the door into my village, and I was struck by how like it just looked and felt vivid and real. And I mean, like, I could see so much detail on everything. It wasn't just like a kind of vague blob where the buildings should be. I could see like the brickwork and everything in the buildings. I could hear the sound of the ocean. I could like feel the breeze. So it was really strikingly real. I mean, obviously, I some dreams aren't quite as real as that. But I mean, look, in principle, it seems like there could be dreams that are, more stable, more real, seemingly real, as it were, than others. And so, I think that, yes, there's a distinction between our everyday experiences and the experiences we have when we dream. But I don't think that's a distinction that's like so significant that I would be willing to rule out the idea that what I'm experiencing right now is ultimately of the same kind. It seems like at best it's just a sort of difference in degree. But dreams still have certain regularities. There's still a kind of coherence to them. So like, yes, it's true that, when I maybe look at a piece of text and then I look away and then I look at the text again, the text looks different. But on the other hand, all of the dreams that I've had, I've been able to sort of control my body in much the same way that I control my body in waking life. My room, for instance, looks pretty much the same as it does in waking life. So I think that, there are sort of regularities and coherence relations in dreams, much the same way as there is in waking life. I would also add as well that even in waking life, there's actually a lot of irregularity. So think about classic example, right? Every single day for a year, the turkey is given food and it's treated really well by the farmer. But then on Christmas Eve, the turkey gets its head cut off. Now, obviously, we're able to look at that and see that this irregularity is actually a product of some further regularity, namely the fact that the farmer eats turkey every year at Christmas. But like what we actually find in our experiences is some regularities and some irregularities, and we can hope that the irregularities will be explained by further regularities. But I mean, that's not something that's just manifest in your immediate experience, I would suggest.
That seems like a scaling factor, right? Where Shiloh and I talk about this all the time, where it's if you are a mayfly and you are born and you experience your entire life in the span of a day, you don't have the concept of winter. You don't have the concept of the fact that it gets cold and everything goes to sleep and the world changes and the ice covers everything. You might have some vague metaphoric sense of an arc. Like, let's say that the mayfly has sufficient consciousness to be able to conceptualize, I was young once and now the arc bends towards darkness. But it's unlikely that can go one step farther. And so it seems like what you're saying here is reflective of nature constantly, that there are cycles that we cannot see. It's like a dimension that is above where we exist. That we can consider that perhaps it's there, but we can't actually reach into it to touch it with certainty. It's just a projection that we have to reconstruct.
Well, I mean, or I suppose the metaphor might be better stated as it being below, because I suppose the way that we usually discover the regularities behind the irregularities is through a kind of reductive inquiry. We sort of break things down into their parts and figure out how the parts behave. Like, I think if you were to go into a rainforest, then what you're confronted with is just this enormous complexity. And I mean, it's not like that. Yeah, there are going to be like some regularities, very broadly speaking. I mean, maybe that, okay, if I get bitten by a snake, then I'm in trouble. But even that doesn't really work, because actually sometimes a snake will bite you and it won't deliver the venom. And then there are non-venomous snakes and so on. But like all of these, what you're confronted with is just this, mass of stuff. And then you investigate it, you break it down into its parts, you figure out the underlying laws, and then you start to find these regularities. I think it's worth noting actually that when it comes to dreams, it's not as if anybody has ever been able to conduct like hundreds of years of scientific inquiry within the dream world itself. So to assume that that it seems, at least if we're approaching this from a kind of skeptical point of view, it seems unreasonable to just assume that the kind of irregularities that we find in dreams are not ultimately going to be explained by underlying regularities. Actually, I think even if you accept the common sense worldview, you would want to explain the irregularities in dreams in virtue of underlying regularities, because they would be the irregularities that you have in the dream world would be explained by underlying regularities in the behavior of brains. So there's like stuff happening in the brain, and ultimately that stuff is going to be governed by physical laws, and that's what's producing the strange things happening in these dream worlds. So yeah, I think I don't see such a significant distinction between waking life and dreaming life.
Well, it's really interesting because you place the origination of all of this in the brain, but I feel like the scale that I'm talking about is very much beyond the brain, because we're moving through the galaxy, we're moving through the universe, we're moving from place to place on long-term cycles. Like, I just learned recently that we're actually processing through the arms of the Milky Way. Did you know this?
Mm-hmm.
Had no idea.
Up and down.
So like basically sometimes we're in the dark parts, sometimes we're in the light
Okay.
parts.
Oh, okay.
And so there's this organizing pattern of basically greater and lesser density in the galaxy. And the solar system is moving just a little bit faster than the rotation of the entire galaxy. So it gradually
right.
moves from the dense bright parts to the less dense dark parts.
Okay.
And so there's all these, now that this is more or less common knowledge, though I've arrived to it late, I've started to realize that there's all of these theories about things that happen on Earth that are a product of that cycle. And so when I think of the brain, I also think of the brain as the product of that kind of disparate scale of cycles. So as solar system is to galaxy, the brain is to ecosystem, the brain is to geologic time. I don't know. Do you get what I'm trying to drive at here?
Sure. Just to clarify, I mean, I myself, I'm not committing to the idea that ultimately consciousness is to be explained by
As a
brain
skeptic,
states
I
or
wouldn't
anything, but
expect you to commit to the idea.
no. Um, no. So yeah, I mean, there's this interesting like movement that started happening in at least in philosophy of mind called the extended mind. And so the idea is that, well, initially it started out as this claim that cognitive states literally extend beyond the brain. The David Chalmers and Andy Clark had this article where they gave the example of somebody who has dementia and they use a notebook to help them in their daily life, right? And so they will write down things like directions in their notebook. So, if you imagine one person who's a completely normal human being who wants to get to the Museum of Modern Art, then what do? Well, they just think, right? They kind of retrieve the information that is encoded somehow in their brain, presumably. They retrieve the information. The Museum of Modern Art is down this street, and then they go down that street. Then you take the person with dementia and they want to go to the Museum of Modern Art. They retrieve the information by looking at the notebook and then they act on it. And so the idea is that, well, what's written in that notebook is literally a belief. It's literally part of their mind. So we should model their mind not as reducing to the brain, but as like reducing to this kind of coupled system of like brain plus body plus notebook. Now, once you take that step, you sort of start to wonder, like, well, okay, how far does that go exactly? Like, once you're willing to propose that the mind is literally constituted by things outside the brain, it's not at all clear, like, where you draw the line on that. Like, well, I don't know. I mean, why shouldn't my mind just be constituted by like this entire room? I mean, I've organized my room in such a way as to make my actions more efficient, so maybe this is just literally what my mind consists in. So yeah, I mean, that seems like a totally plausible idea to me. I don't know if that's quite what you were suggesting, but yeah.
Well, I kind of. Were you going to say something? Go ahead.
I have a different line of questioning.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I guess I just wanted to add to that your room probably is part of your mind. And in biology, we have especially in genetics, you ask the question, is something both necessary and sufficient? And that's how you tease apart impact inside of a system. Because if something is necessary for a system to work, it is not as key for the system as something that is sufficient for the system to work, right? So like, let's say you have 10 genes, you cut one out, and all of a sudden the system doesn't work. And then you cut out all the other 9, but you bring the one back in and the system works again. That one is both necessary and sufficient. And so you can say that, okay, so this is some master regulator, and then you can go downstream and you can like figure out all these other things. And so I'd say that the piece of paper is necessary but not sufficient to create a mind. What is necessary and sufficient is the body itself in which all that stuff is, because you can't imagine somebody without a brain making the marks on the piece of paper or reading the marks on the piece of paper and integrating them. And that's kind of one of the problems that I have with this idea of how we look at consciousness, which is that it seems to want to be able to divorce it from the body and to be able to look at it as this bauble that kind of exists in the absence of minds. And I think that that's a very philosophical trick that doesn't hold in a biological sense.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, my impression is that most philosophers would say that consciousness is ultimately a product of bodily states, like brain states, but it's like ultimately just going to reduce in some sense to physical processes. I could be wrong about that, but that's my impression of what the consensus is at the moment. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure.
That's fine. I mean, I think that I'm thinking mostly of like the idea of the philosophical zombie, right? Which is the thought experiment about knowing the other mind. And if the mind, if you see somebody who's behaving in a way that looks like they're behaving as a conscious entity, but they're not actually a conscious entity, could you tell the difference?
Yeah, okay.
And so that's an impossible thought experiment.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that I would be happy to say that zombies are conceivable. I think I can imagine them. So when I say zombie here, I mean the kind of like something that's molecule for molecule identical to me, but there's just nothing going on inside, as it were. So it has a brain, and it has exactly the same processes going on in its brain as are going on in my brain, but the zombie just has no first person point of view. It has no consciousness. So I think that sort of case is imaginable or conceivable, but I don't think that conceivability or imaginability really tells us much about the way the world actually is. I think that all sorts of things are conceivable in some sense. I mean, like, it's conceivable because clearly, I can describe what the zombie is. I can tell stories about it. I can make inferences from this concept of a philosophical zombie. So I'd be happy to grant that it's conceivable, but I don't see any reason to assume that what what we are capable of conceiving tells us the underlying metaphysics of the world. That seems like a really big leap to me, and I don't think there's a good argument for it. So I mean, zombies might just be impossible, even though I can conceive of them.
Interesting.
I wanted to get your reaction to a conversation that we just had on the podcast yesterday, I believe. We had a gentleman on who was making a wide criticism of our academic epistemology, especially in terms of science, and that it was essentially set up at some point, I think around the 50s or sometime in the 20th century, that a good idea would be to let all of the nerds essentially be the decision base for the government, because all of these scientists were concerned with objective truth. They would make essentially great policy advisors and so forth. And in reality, it turned out that they were just human beings, and they were easily captured by the same power influences as the politicians that they were hoping to, that everyone had hoped they would supplant, essentially. And I'm curious what you think about the epistemology in the sciences, because on one hand, we would hope that we were coming to know more and more about the world in a very functional, practical way. But at the same time, there's a lot of stamp collecting and things that are funded because they're safe and practical. He brought up the case particularly with the whole Wuhan Virology Institute that was kind of a disaster where, people are trying to learn more about viruses, so they essentially start engineering really awful viruses, and then, what becomes of that? Was that really a useful endeavor in the first place, or was it just a nightmare? And so, yeah, I'm curious if you think that academic science suffers from a failed epistemological methodology, or if you can imagine a better version of that, or if you think it's totally hunky-dory.
So with respect to the epistemological side of it, like, okay, what are the sort of appropriate scientific methods or something like that? I mean, I would just like, I kind of don't really feel qualified to comment, because I'm not a scientist, and I do feel like scientists seem to be able to kind of get along fine, without the input of philosophers. So,
I would say that they can't. I think I
Yeah, I don't think
genuinely.
so. I guess I should frame this a little bit better in that the thing that everybody calls the scientific method is in all reality much more an engineering method. It's a method of devising formula that are predictive, that allow you to do something practical. And most of the funding that we would say is scientific funding is aimed towards some practical engineering output. Very little of it is science in the original sense of natural philosophy, like let's figure out how nature does its magic tricks. It's more aimed at harnessing those and parameterizing those phenomena. Even the thing that we call a theory in, say, physics, a theory in physics or in biochemistry is really an equation that describes how some system operates. It doesn't actually give us the component material actors and what's really happening. There's not necessarily a cause and effect picture there. There's really just a description that allows us to plug in different variables, change the shape of the wing so we can get better lift, get better efficiency, whatever it is, generate more conductive nanomaterials. They're always aimed at something. And so I think that the concern is that if science is left to the engineers, then you have only one knowledge base which is valued, and you don't have actual investigation into nature itself, which might not be valued.
I mean, I feel like you might not like my view on this, because my general inclination is to favor a kind of instrumentalist account of scientific theories. So the sort of view I would have is that what science gives us are very useful tools, very useful instruments for predicting, systematizing, and controlling what we experience. Right. So it's ultimately trying to give us descriptions that accommodate the observable phenomena. Like the theories and models, like they're instruments for predicting and controlling the observable phenomena. That's the sort of view that I would favor. Now, the thing is, though, the caveat to this is that I don't think there's really any universal method that will promote that. So it may well be the case, and I think it actually often is the case, that one of the most efficient ways of coming up with theories and models that allow us to predict and control the observable phenomena, one of the most efficient ways of coming up with those things is by doing what we might traditionally think of as more sort of metaphysical investigation. So we're sort of interested in learning, like, what's going on behind the phenomena. What is the world really like? We want to get at the truth. We want to get at the facts. It turns out that if you have a bunch of people who devote themselves to that, they, as a very pleasant byproduct, they come up with these theories and models that are instrumentally successful. In the end, though, I mean, like, my view on this is, I don't think that science really gets at the truth. But that's not to say that there's anything, I mean, that's certainly, like, that's not to say anything negative about it, because nothing else, in my view, really gets at the truth either. So it's not as though science is in any way like, I'm not denigrating it in saying that. But yeah.
Well, it's kind of crazy how you can develop functional models that will take you pretty far, but in order to punch through the next step, you do have to come to some actual scientific understanding. There's a lot of cases of this, but I mean, if you just think about, a caveman designing a bow and arrow, he didn't actually have to understand anything about air and molecules and laminar flow and all these things. He really just had to experiment with different designs and until he came up with a functional way of doing it. And a lot of fundamental science is done this way too, where you're also just trying different models on and tweaking them until you get something that approximates how some predictable behavior will unfold.
Archaeology too.
Yeah.
Just because like people find stuff because they accidentally stumble on it in the fields. Like there's not that many places where people say, aha, we will go here and we will find it.
And it just seems like it has a limitation to it if you get locked into that way of thinking. Anastasia came up with this really good example where we're just talking about the limitations of our mathematical conception of fundamental physics, where she was like, look, you could also imagine a parallel universe where people approached biology and genetics the same way, where instead of realizing that there was this actual material body called DNA that was responsible for inheritance, you could have just left it at math and come up with genetic fields to describe all of the behaviors in the nucleus. All of these hereditary actions were the results of hereditary fields. The fields interacted with a known set of equations. There was predictable outcomes, and you get pretty far. But you're never going to come up with something like CRISPR-Cas if you don't have an actual structural understanding of the genetic material itself. And so it seems like we run the risk of ending up at those brick walls in other disciplines, in particular fundamental physics. What were you going to say, Anastasia? Consciousness too.
I think that there's a piece of that I just realized while you were speaking, which is that we won't have CRISPR-Cas because we'll be so busy dealing with how to mathematically describe. Do you know what CRISPR-Cas is?
It's gene edits, something to do with
yeah. It's basically just like they found this bacterial immune system that they realized was used for changing out DNA base pairs, and then they found a way to be able to harness that inside of the body. And so you can take something that you found in nature, you can modify it, and now it can do in vivo genetic modifications for humans. But the reason that we wouldn't get to it in a mathematical genetic field universe is because we would be so busy trying to figure out the mathematics of how it worked that we would never get to the point of being able to say, hey, hold on a second, there's actually this thing that's a molecule that has a shape that we can modify, and because we've modified that shape, it behaves differently, and now it does this thing that we want, and we can cure cancer.
I do wonder, though, I mean, so we might not be able to get to something like CRISPR-Cas, but then maybe we would be able to get to other things that we are not so good at getting to. So that, like, in the mathematical field universe, would that necessarily be an impoverished science, or would it just be a kind of different science where we achieve different things? I don't know, but
I think that it's really interesting because I've been looking at data for the benefits from particle physics, right? Somebody tell me some technology that has come out of particle physics that is really, really useful for us in the world today, right? Particle physics is probably the most mathematical of the physical disciplines.
This is where we're refining those field equations and so forth, essentially using empirical data.
Like Large Hadron Collider's Fermilab, right? Progressively, you see headlines all the time that we've discovered some fifth force of nature. The muons are behaving heavily.
And these serve to fill in the blanks in those mathematical descriptions, essentially.
Absolutely. But there's strikingly little material benefit from those discoveries. Contrast that with biology. Biomedicine. Right? So you make a discovery, and what you do is you immediately leverage it into the side of engineering. This is what Shiloh is talking about, which is the fact that like science is the process by which you look at a system for long enough to be able to say, oh, interesting, that works this way. And then engineering is the process by which you take that thing where, oh, it's interesting, it works this way. I bet you that we could tweak it to make it work that way. And then you get something useful out of it. And so because biology is a physical science, we spend all of this time thinking about stuff. But physics is a really unphysical science these days. It's very mathematical. The ether died in the late 1800s. And ever since then, we've been kind of comfortable with this idea that there isn't really anything real. And so all of these conversations of like simulation and the dream world and brain and vat, to me, come down to the fact that philosophically, physics has been accepted as a material-less discipline. And it's unique in the sciences. And that's the cleavage that Shiloh's like, they kick me out of the philosophy forum because it's physics, and they kick me out of the physics forums because it's philosophy. That's the cleavage that no one seems to want to look at. It's like water off a duck's back when you bring it up to physicists and when you bring it up to philosophers. They're like, that's not my problem.
Yeah, I don't know if this is even a new thing. I mean, like you can go back, like back to Newton, and like there was a sort of general assumption in Newton's time that we have to explain things by giving these like intelligible mechanical models, right? Like things pushing and pulling each other. And then Newton comes along with his theory of gravity, where gravity is just this like weird kind of occult force. It's just a force, and like, well, how does the force work? Don't worry about it. Like the point is, the theory gives you the right predictions, so it just doesn't matter like what's really going on. And like the theory did give you the right predictions, and for that reason, that theory triumphed. So, I mean, it does seem to be the case that like what ultimately wins out is just whether or not you get the right predictions from the theory. And at least on that point, I believe that particle physics is, one of the most successful sciences, right?
But at the same time, we haven't made any progress in manipulating gravity or fundamental light phenomena at the same time. Like some of these basic things seem to be limited because we don't really understand what gravity is. I mean, there's all sorts of analogies and mathematical descriptions, but fundamentally, in a material basis, how an atom is exerting that force on its neighbor is something that just gets sidelined. And I'm 100% certain that if we figure that out, it will lead to technological breakthroughs. But it's not part of the conversation right now. And I think that's a little bit of a tragedy.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that, yeah.
I think that it's an interesting philosophical fracture that if we're talking about knowledge about the world, if you have a predictive theory, the predictive theory can be an incorrect story that you tell to get to the math, right? Because I think okay, let's maybe figure out what is the relationship between math and knowledge. Is that a reasonable question?
Well, there's two aspects to this. So, I mean, on the one hand, we could just be talking about like abstract mathematics, and when it comes to just like mathematics in the abstract, I would say that doesn't in itself tell us anything about the world. I mean, we can, you can develop all sorts of different mathematical systems, and you don't have to worry about what's going on in the world at all. But then there's the application of mathematics within science. So, like for instance, I mean, you can. It was once thought that like it's just like a necessary fact that the world has a Euclidean structure, right? That the structure of space is Euclidean. Of course, we then developed non-Euclidean geometries, and it turned out that maybe the structure of space is actually non-Euclidean. But even if the structure of space even if it was Euclidean, well, we could still explore non-Euclidean geometries, right? So there's just the kind of abstract mathematics, and then there's the application of mathematics within the process of empirical inquiry. And so I think that like I take it when you're asking about the relationship between math and knowledge, you mean it in the second sense. Is that right? Like,
I mean, I think that you laid it out well, right? Because there is two senses of it, first of all. And so I'm glad that we're at least on the same page about that, because I do think that there's a realm.
I think it's just called pure mathematics, right? There's mathematics departments who aren't concerned with and then there's applied mathematics.
Which to me is a really fascinating discipline, that there's somebody who studies just like pure logic.
Well, it's like it's people who study tools or something. I don't know. It's like you're refining.
There's not like a hammer major in the local college.
Well, I mean, there's people who do like, what's the, like there's a keto martial arts, right? Which are more about form and beauty.
Yeah.
And then there's like jujitsu where you're actually trying to strangle somebody.
Yeah.
So there's like different ways of applying that same idea.
And I think that it's important that when we talk about the relationship of math to knowledge, that we talk about the fact that there's a certain type of math that doesn't bear upon knowledge, which I take to be something about how we understand the world.
okay. Although the results that come from the pure mathematics investigations can have surprising applications empirically. So I think that was the case with the development of non-Euclidean geometry. Like initially it was just a bunch of mathematicians playing games, and it didn't have any kind of empirical application. Like it took I don't know, like a century or something before that, before we were like, oh, actually this has some sort of utility in science. So you never know where these where these like empirically useful tools will come from.
I think there's another revolution happening right now too. I mean, this like tensor calculus was really important for the development of relativity, but it seems like there's a possibility that it will be replaced by geometric algebra right now, which is a simpler way of doing the same calculations that doesn't involve these multidimensional tensors that are really hard, really hard to manipulate and work with. And so I think that there is always some sort of pure mathematics going on in the background, which will be dragged into the fold. But I think Anastasia, you're talking about a particular kind of knowledge. Because what the hell does knowledge mean? I guess from in a philosophical sense, it's a huge concept.
Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, there's no way of answering that question that's not going to be extremely controversial. I suppose traditionally,
embrace it.
Traditionally, the view was, well, actually, this probably isn't even true. But the story is that the traditional view was that knowledge is justified true belief. So, like how is it that for instance, I want to say I know that I have hands, right? It's because it's true that I have hands, and I believe that I have hands, and I am justified in believing that I have hands. Now, exactly what it is to be justified in believing something is a very difficult question. Like, I guess in the case of having hands, the justification is going to consist in the fact that I have this visual impression of having hands, and other people will tell me that I have hands. So there's like testimony from others that I have hands.
Especially
none of my experiences. Oh, yeah.
Is that an Aristotelian definition, by the
way? This definition comes well, I don't know where it comes from originally. It was stated in Plato, and then there is a sort of myth that it was held by like philosophers for thousands of years up until the last century. I say that's a myth because actually there's always been a lot of debate about whether that's the right way of looking at knowledge. But yeah, justified true belief, that seems to capture something of what we have in mind, when we talk about knowledge, I guess. So I suppose it's you could. I tend to just sort of adopt that definition for ease of discussion. But yeah.
I mean, like, just to play devil's advocate, could a very superstitious person say that their belief in that their deceased ancestors talking to them on the other side of the room at all times be justified true belief as well? Or, the belief in some deity, let's say some evangelical fundamentalist of some sort. I mean, it's interesting because these people do seem to live a little bit like these really religious people seem to live longer. They seem to be happier. Does that mean that their knowledge of God is true?
Well, I am going to assume that there is not, in fact, a deceased person talking to them. So then it wouldn't count as knowledge by that definition. It might well be very, very difficult and perhaps even impossible for us to figure out whether or not we have knowledge. So it might well be that, like, I know that I have hands, and another person who believes in God does not know that God exists. And maybe the only difference between us is that, like, my belief is true and their belief is false. But the problem is that beliefs do not come with little labels that say true and false. So, you like, ultimately, when I take it that I have a true belief that I have hands. I mean, what's that based on? Well, it's just going to be based on what I'm perceiving. It's going to be based on various background beliefs. Like, ultimately, the belief that I have hands, maybe it fits in with the rest of my beliefs in a kind of coherent and satisfying way. But yeah, I mean, that belief does not just, it doesn't announce its truth in any way. So, but I mean, like, I don't think, like, any definition of knowledge presumably would have to contend with the fact that there's a great deal of debate, not just among philosophers, but among ordinary people, about what it is that we know, right? Like, some people think that they do know that there is a God. Some people think that there isn't God. So it's maybe not surprising that on this definition of knowledge, it's going to be very difficult to figure out whether or not we have knowledge in any given case.
Like, in some sense, it's shocking that the word truth is so ambiguous. It's thrown around all the time. Like, if you go to court, they're like, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And you don't get to be like, what do you mean by truth, Your Honor? That's a huge question. I think we should talk about what truth really means. But in some sense, that's a very natural question for a philosopher to ask. But in everyday usage, people seem to understand intuitively, like, right away, what it is.
Yeah, I suppose intuitively, maybe I shouldn't comment on other people's intuitions here. For me, at least intuitively, to say that something is true is to say that it, corresponds to reality, corresponds to the way things are. So I think that, like, again,
like shared reality.
Yeah, I mean, well, independent reality, like what's going on independently of me and you. So, like, I say, for instance, that I have hands. When I say that this is true, right, it seems to me that what I'm communicating is something like, I have this belief in my mind, or maybe like a model in my mind. You can maybe even think of it as like a little picture, right? There's like a little picture of hands. And then that picture, in some sense, like, matches or corresponds to what's happening in the world. So actually, I mean, what I'm thinking is that there's, like, I have this, like, model of myself with hands, and then I'm thinking of the world where the world contains a body with hands, and I'm like, oh yeah, those two things match. Of course, the problem with this is that, well, I can never actually get outside my own mind and check that my belief corresponds to what is happening beyond my mind. So, if you think of truth in that sense, then it becomes a little bit unclear how you could ever be justified in saying that anything is true. But I think, I mean, for me, that's the intuitive way that I would think about truth.
And I think that that's why people love math so much, because math is the abstract, completely universal, foundational way that you can point to something and say, that is true. I throw the ball and it will always fly in exactly this way. And that is telling me something that I can know about the universe, because no matter who throws it, no matter how they throw it, it'll always go the same way. And so in that sense, I think that math is deeply tied into our understanding of truth, which is that once you can parameterize it, and once you can use that equation to predict something that's going to happen down the line, then you have something that is true. And that's the easiest, like least political truth that I can imagine. But it's also, if you look at something like forensics and bite mark analysis and all of these things that blood spatter analysis, all these things that they use in order to build evidentiary cases, what it comes down to is that it is a proxy for the certainty of equations.
Yeah, I think so that there's a worry that I would have about this, which is it seems to me that like mathematics is applicable to claims about the world only once those claims have been kind of idealized. So like if you think about, throwing a ball, right? Well, what we want to say is, there's this regularity in the world, or maybe even just a regularity in our experiences. Maybe we don't even have to talk about the world, right? We can just say, I perceive this thing and then I throw it with a certain force and then it has a certain trajectory. And of course, that can be described mathematically. But whenever you whenever you throw a ball, the exact trajectory of the ball, the speed at which it travels, is going to depend on, the material the ball is made of, the weight of the ball. It's going to depend on, like the atmosphere, right? Like the pressure, right? The temperature, probably. Like there's all of these different factors that are going to influence how the ball actually behaves. And I think what we do is, we can throw a ball many, many, many times, and you sort of abstract from any of those specific throws, right? So like, let's say you throw a ball 100 times, you can kind of abstract from each specific case, and you get this like idealized case where we're sort of treating it as if everything is fixed. So, you kind of treat it as if the temperature is fixed, the pressure is fixed, the mass of the ball is fixed, etc. But in reality, none of that stuff is ever going to be fixed. Like in reality, if you say, well, so like, in other words, let's say I make a claim about the speed at which the ball travels when it's thrown with a particular force. Well, that claim is always going to be, strictly speaking, false. Now you could say, well, I'm going to describe the speed at which.
That.
Oh, sorry.
Why would that be false?
So, if you give a particular value for the speed of the ball, then that's going to be, strictly speaking, false, because in fact, in any given situation, there's always going to be like slight variations in the factors affecting the speed of the ball. So what you could do is hold those factors fixed. You could say, well, if you have a ball of exactly this weight and, you have exactly this pressure and make everything exact, well, then maybe you can get a claim which is just true for that specific situation. But that's not going to be generalizable. So the claim you make is not really going to be applicable to any other situations. So there's this kind of interesting trade-off where like the mathematics is applicable only after we've kind of abstracted or idealized somewhat from the specific situation. I don't know. Hopefully
this is something
sense.
that, God, you're really striking at something that we've spent a lot of time talking to people about, because there is a belief in the world that mathematics is a language. It's not a hugely popular belief, right? If you say that in a room, most people will kind of nod along, but they might not be fervent evangelicals of that belief. But there are people who genuinely do believe that mathematics is a language, and that it is sufficient to tell you something about the world. And I think that what you're getting at is you're like, no, hold on a second. If you're going to use math to tell you something about the world, what you have to do first is you have to take a step back and you have to ask yourself about the system that you're looking at and understand the limitations of how it will change or how it won't change in order to set up your conditions so that the math tells you something that is actually useful for the question that you might be interested in asking. Right? Because as we're talking about the ball and throwing it, I'm like, if you throw it 100 times in the span of maybe a minute, then things won't change that much from moment to moment in your parameters. You might get like a really good cluster of measurements. But if you throw it once every 10 years and the ball starts to degrade and the machine that you're using to throw it starts to fall apart, then you start to get really different data. And it's the same trial, really.
Yeah.
And yet you can come up with something completely different. And so we run across this all the time because we talk to a lot of people that are very, very mathematical. And the underlying thing that we're trying to slip into their brains is, hey, are you sure? Are you absolutely dead certain that the mathematical claims that you're making about the world have taken into account enough details about the system that you're studying to be able to tell the story that you're telling about the ball falling at a specific rate or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'd actually be quite happy with the idea that mathematics is a kind of language, but then I think that ordinary language, whenever we make claims about the world, that's also going to be highly idealized. But I mean, with respect to mathematics, I think that maybe a better example to sort of illustrate a similar point would just be, look at the ways in which we use mathematics in the context of like highly idealized systems. So, you can have like a differential equation that describes the behavior of a pendulum, where we have a sort of a model pendulum or an idealized pendulum, where we assume, we just like make the assumption, at least for the simple pendulum model, that you have like a completely rigid string, and you have a point mass, and there's no gravity and there's no friction, right? Like we just strip away all of these things that you find in the actual world, and then you get this very powerful piece of mathematics. So I think that for any kind of claim that's made about the world, even when you can use mathematics to make that claim, there's a lot of idealization and abstraction involved, and so it's not entirely clear to me, like, are we kind of just like finding the mathematics in the world, or is it more like, well, we look at the world, we're confronted with a kind of blooming, buzzing confusion of experiences, and then we have to sort of take a more like constructive role in selecting particular experiences, simplifying them, abstracting, and then you're able to sort of say, well, we've found this kind of universal mathematical law. I think it's very often going to be the second.
One of the problems with treating math as a language is that you can communicate patterns, but in order to contextualize them, you need actual words. Like math, if you really think about it, if you treat it as a language, it really comes down to being exclusively quantitative adverbs. You're essentially saying how much something is happening at. And without some English to go alongside it, you can't actually make a sentence with mathematics. Like, you can run into problems with this, because if you handed an alien, say, a set of differential equations for heat flow, they might think you were talking about diffusion instead, because it's the exact same analogous set of equations. You just have that the variables mean different things all of a sudden. Instead of charge, you might have fluid like volume or something like that. So you have all of these mathematical relationships which repeat themselves over and over in nature, but without some contextualization, you can't actually get true meaning from them. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it's dangerous to treat math as a language per se, because the contextualization, the explanation part of it is really important.
I think that's contextualization is the key here, right? It's the network of ideas that you fit your discoveries into, and that has to include in it a recognition of our own limitations when it comes to the kinds of questions that we can ask and the things that we look at. Like, I think that, Kane, what you're saying about the nature of constants, it's a question of, is it really a constant, or is it an artifact of how we measure things?
So think my sort of take is that, well, I guess as I said earlier, like I tend to be more on the instrumentalist side. I don't think that ultimately we're, uncovering or like discovering these things in the world behind the phenomena. But I mean, like, yeah, I think this point about like mathematics, it's one of the reasons why I've always sort of been very suspicious of things like the mathematical universe hypothesis, because ultimately I just think what you have to do with any kind of mathematical model, at least if it's at least in the context of science, it seems to me that you have to identify it with like some physical or like material, broadly speaking, system. Like, so just kind of having the abstract mathematics isn't really going to be that useful unless you can sort of tie particular parts of that to particular things in the world. And then as long as you can do that, the mathematics can be highly idealized, as in the case of a simple pendulum model. Like, I can treat that as a model of say a pendulum in a grandfather clock. Now, in the for what's happening in the grandfather clock, there is gravity, there is air resistance, etc. That's not the case for the simple mathematical model. But I've got this model, and I've identified particular aspects of the model with something in my experience, and that seems to me to be where like mathematics is very useful.
And it also is what makes people really want to be able to trust in science, right? Because like you've said, you have this simplified model of the pendulum, and it becomes something that you can trust. You can use that to design something. It's the basis of a faith-based existence that we're all more or less content with, because we know that the airplane will fly, the bridge will hold, the car will drive, because it is built on the basis of these mathematical relationships that have been held together tightly enough for long enough and have been examined under enough circumstances that your car's not going to explode when you fill the tank with gas.
Is it faith-based? I mean, is that the position you want to take?
I think so. I think that the reason that we can all exist and just kind of do stuff is because we believe we accept it, right? Because I think that if you go down the rabbit hole of we don't understand how a pendulum works because of what you're describing, which is that you can continuously go farther and farther down, and as the clockwork mechanism of the winding starts to lose tension, it changes the way that the pendulum swings, and you can make it progressively more complex. You lose your mind if you go down that path. That's somebody who's constantly being like, you know what, we can't know if we live on a flat earth or not. Like that's the same level. That's the same level of inability to function that you get on both ends of that spectrum. Like, you can't have an engineer who does that, because the engineer would never be able to build anything, because the engineer needs to be able to make simple adjustments to nature that are good enough that they can use to get to the next step, basically, which is the flying car or whatever.
Right. I mean, at some point, maybe inquiry kind of just comes to an end. I mean, so actually, with the case of like the flat Earth, I mean, I think that so it's quite plausible to me to say that there is a sense in which, for people living thousands and thousands of years ago in small scale societies, it was just true that the Earth was flat. So, by which I mean, when they talked about like the Earth or the world or whatever, well, they're talking about the place where we live, and certainly in one's kind of immediate experience, it appears to be flat. It's much more like the surface of the Earth is more like the surface of my table here than it is like the surface of a ball, at least in terms of what I can do with it. So yeah, if you were living in a small scale society where you didn't have any real interest in long range navigation, you didn't think about you didn't think about things in a very theoretically sophisticated way, then that would be I think, a perfectly acceptable idealization. You'd say the Earth is flat, and given the sort of standards and assumptions at play in that society, that would just be true. Of course, for us today, well, we live in a society which is highly globalized. We do tend to think about things from a more theoretical point of view. People have, globes. They have photos of the Earth taken by satellites and things. So it's no longer an appropriate idealization to say that the Earth is flat. But we do say that the Earth is a sphere. And I mean, that's like, if you want to talk about like what the Earth is really like, I mean, saying that it's a sphere, that's not strictly speaking true either. I mean, the Earth has all sorts of bumps all over it, so it's certainly not a perfect sphere. Maybe it should be modeled more like an oblate spheroid. Sometimes it's modeled as like a geoid, which like so you can like model the shape that the Earth would take if it were just made of water or something like that. So these sorts of alternative ways of modeling the Earth maybe are like more accurate than saying that the Earth is a sphere. But given our context, given the standards that we're using, the Earth is a sphere is a perfectly appropriate idealization. I do sometimes wonder, like, if you were to imagine a race of creatures that had quite different cognitive systems to us, maybe even just AI, right? So like maybe let's say we develop AI and we get general intelligence from it, so artificial general intelligence. I do sometimes wonder whether maybe from their point of view, our claim that the Earth is a sphere would be as absurdly wrong as the claim that the Earth is flat. Because again, it's like actually it it isn't strictly speaking a sphere. So yeah, I that's sort of one way to look at it. That like, well, what counts as true is kind of going to depend on these like assumptions and standards and that and goals that we have.
And there's like a certain level of generalizability about these mathematical statements too, which I think can throw you off, right? Like you can definitely say the pendulum is like, you can just say a pendulum is described by this equation, but what you would very quickly find is that so are atomic bonds, for instance, right? But you're not going to like mistake an atomic bond for a pendulum because you're able to contextualize it. And the mathematics alone isn't capable of doing that. Despite making very true statements about each of the systems, they're not saying that the systems are identical. And so there's this layer of identity that's left out of mathematics, which can really become frustrating, I think, in fundamental physics.
And I would hope that whatever AI we develop would look at flat Earth versus sphere Earth versus oblate spheroid Earth and be able to say that these are true given specific perspectives, uses, and frames, right? Because like you were saying, if you're not a navigational society, the Earth is flat. If you are an atomic physicist, the atomic bond is a pendulum. If you're a clockmaker, the pendulum is a pendulum. But both are true and functional and are changed only by, I think, only by technology. Like, I think that there's no way to talk about humans and our way of encountering knowledge and understanding without dealing with technology, because that is always inevitably the way that we apply the things that we learn, right? We're talking about abstract mathematics as being something theoretical that's figured out in an academy. But what do you do with it? You sail across the world when you realize that you can navigate by the stars, or you build AGI, or whatever. The goal is always to use the thing that you figured out and to just...
Like the most useful truth is going to be the one that prevails, kind of thing.
Which is why whenever we talk to people about like, hey, we don't understand how light and gravity work, they're kind of like, we have cell phones. And that's the end of that conversation, basically.
Yeah, I think there is a role for multiplicity of theory that's not totally popular right now. It really is what we say, that there's multiple ways to describe a system and have them all be true, is quite fascinating. And I think that the convergence of all those perspectives leads to an even greater truth. You think that's reasonable? Like, I teach astronomy at the university, and the first few weeks, like, we're going through essentially the old, like, actually the way that our basic astronomical coordinate system is set up is essentially treating the sky as if it's a dome that flies over your head every day. And even the modern way of describing the locations of stars is based on that.
Which drove me crazy when you were trying to explain that to me, because that was so foreign.
Yeah, it's wild, but it works, right? It works. You can absolutely treat the sky like it's a dome that cycles over your head, and it's the same. All of the mathematical relationships remain in place, but it's not true when you zoom out and actually realize that, hey, we're on this ball that's spinning and it's going around the solar system and all of those. But it's still useful, even to this day, in terms of plotting locations of stars and so forth.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is one of like that. So, within philosophy of science, there's this like big debate between realists and anti-realists. So the scientific realists are people who will say that science gives us knowledge of the world, right? Like it reveals what's really going on behind the phenomena. Anti-realists deny that. So earlier I kind of expressed an anti-realist view when I said that I like my view is, okay, scientific theories are more like instruments for predicting and controlling the phenomena. But ultimately we never really come to understand what's going on in reality. So I think that the main motivation for taking realism seriously is going to have something to do with the enormous success of science. So it's like, this point about cell phones and stuff, right? It's like, why do we believe that there are, electrons and black holes and mitochondria and all of these other things that are postulated by our best theories? Well, it's because these theories are so successful. They make predictions that turn out to be true. The theories can be used in the development of technologies like cell phones. Like the theories work. That's the difference between modern scientific theories and the Homeric gods, right? The reason why we believe in electrons but not the Homeric gods is because the theories that postulate electrons are so successful. But I think it turns out that like when we actually like examine science in a bit more detail, we find a great deal of cases where there are very successful applications of theories that we want to say are just false. So yes, there are contexts where you can successfully apply this idea of like just a sphere that turns around the Earth. Newtonian mechanics is still remarkably successful in many contexts. You can send probes to Pluto using Newtonian mechanics. But we don't think that it correctly describes the underlying structure of space and time and gravity and so on. So that sort of thought will motivate, I think, a more kind of anti-realist view where, okay, well, what we get from the sciences is something, it's more sort of, it's like simplifications, abstractions, idealizations, useful falsehoods, and that's the sort of view that I would be more inclined to have.
Good.
No, please.
I worry that the anti-realism is kind of an escapist method that people use to take responsibility out of their own hands. I find that we have different people who come on the show who have let's say, structuralist views for the origins of consciousness. And a lot of the reactions to it seem to be rooted in this deep belief that, in defense of simulation theory and in defense of the impossibility of coming up with a structural explanation for consciousness, they seem to be, to me, to be rooted in this willingness to say, well, none of this is real, and so therefore it's not really my fault if I screw things up, and it's just sort of, it's written in the stars kind of thing. It's not my problem anymore. I guess that's kind of the downside of the unrealism. What is it? Anti-realist perspective that I see.
Well, maybe. I mean, there is another way of looking at this, though, which is on the anti-realist. So, on a realist view, what science provides is like these, correct or accurate models and theories. So, like we just discover the way the world is, right? So, like ultimately, the difference between a successful theory and an unsuccessful theory is going to be something about the world, right? Like if you come up with a successful theory, if you come up with a true theory, then that theory is going to be successful. On the other hand, if you happen to come up with a false theory, then it won't be successful, right? Like that's broadly speaking the kind of view that a realist would have. Whereas on the anti-realist view, like whether or not a theory is successful is not going to be based on whether you're lucky enough to come up with the truth, right? It's going to be based on hard work, right? It's going to be based on, like, your ability, your creativity and imagination, right? Like the anti-realist is going to emphasize the constructive activity on the part of scientists. So, because ultimately, like as we said earlier, beliefs do not come with little tags that say true or false, right? So if you come up with a true theory, you've gotten lucky. And like, I mean, maybe you have also been very intelligent and creative, and maybe you've assessed the evidence very well and so on. But, lots of other people who are very intelligent and creative and who've assessed the evidence properly have come up with different theories that are false. So if you happen to have found the true theory, you've just gotten lucky. Whereas for the anti-realist, there's not really so much luck involved, right? Like if a theory is successful, it's because the people working on that theory, yes, I mean they were lucky enough to sort of latch on to certain observable regularities, but ultimately it's not so much a product of discovery as it is an invention. And so I think that if you look at it that way, maybe that answers that concern. Maybe I don't know, but maybe that puts a bit more responsibility in the hands of scientists. Certainly, I don't think that anti-realism is any excuse for just kind of saying, well, it doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter whether this theory works or not. Nobody really gets at the truth anyway, because we still have all of the usual scientific standards, right? It still has to be a theory that makes correct predictions, and it still has to be a theory that can be applied in the construction of technologies and all of that sort of stuff.
And yet, science is inherently a progressive discipline, unlike philosophy, right? We're all, even if I come up with an amazing theory, let's say that's more predictive than relativity or something, it's by no means the end of the day, probably, right? Somebody's going to eventually come up with a better theory to displace it. And so science is like constantly undergoing this process of swallowing the shame of being wrong, because it's inherently wrong, because it's progressive. It has to come up with new and better ways of understanding fundamental reality as we move down the line.
Maybe. I mean, I would hope so, but I do wonder whether our view of science is a product of us being early in the story. So like there have been these striking revolutions in the history of science where, our like whole worldview has been completely overturned. Like the Copernican revolution, right? The transition from Newtonian mechanics to general relativity, the quantum revolution. So there's been these really striking theoretical developments. But I mean, I don't know what the future is going to bring, but it does seem to me entirely plausible that we might sort of be at a point where we're just kind of like reaching the sort of end of at least those kind of radical changes. I mean, presumably there's always going to be some areas where you can make like bits and pieces of progress, But I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe the sort of worldview that we have now from science is just sort of fixed. But part of this, so one of the things that makes me think this is that science has become like increasingly systematic in the sense that there are like more and more sort of tight connections between different areas of science. So in the past, if you look at something like the transition from the phlogiston theory of chemistry to oxygen theory, well, back then, right, in like the 1700s, really chemistry, okay, it had connections to other disciplines, but it was pretty isolated, So you can like overturn phlogiston theory and replace it with oxygen theory, and not much is going to change elsewhere in science. On the other hand, if there were to be a major scientific revolution in the future, like if we for some reason like need to overturn the standard model of particle physics or something, it looks like that would require radical changes throughout almost all of science. And I mean, part of the problem with this is the problem we talked about earlier, which is there's like this hyper specialization, which is the people who are working on the standard model just don't have the relevant expertise in these other areas to affect a revolution in those other areas, if that makes sense. So maybe it's the case that like this combination of hyper specialization and increasing systematicity means that our current worldview is sort of locked in. That seems plausible to me.
It seems like there's just the huge gains to be made in something like that are on the interpretive level, ultimately. Right? You have increasingly well-defended, rigorous, empirically defined mathematical descriptions of how these events unfold. But at the end of the day, like we were talking to this quantum superconductor professor the other day, and she's the one who brought up, she's like, well, these bonds function like pendulums, like harmonic oscillators. And you're like, okay, well, can that tell us something about the way that the atom is actually behaving? Like, is the atom functionally an elastic structure? And she froze for a little while and was just like, well,
it's an analogy.
That's not how we approach it. Yeah, that's not really a question that's being asked. But maybe it should be a question that's being asked, because if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it might be a duck, right? And maybe if understanding that it is a duck would allow you to manipulate the system better, maybe that would be a scientific breakthrough that wasn't fundamentally guided by any new empiricism or new mathematics. It was just an interpretive level of reassigning what these equations actually mean in the context of the material basis of the phenomenon. So I wonder if the future it's not so much increasingly predictive so much as it is filling in the blanks of what all of these things actually mean in order to further our technological abilities and our ability to manipulate the system.
Because it can actually go two ways. Because we either spend our time filling in the blanks of the mathematics that we've figured out, or we realize that the mathematics that we've been figuring out have some kind of consistent issue with them. I think that those are kind of the only two places that I can point to, right? So imagine that there is a terrible artifact in the design of the Large Hadron Collider, and the reason that the particle physics model has held for as long as it does is that same error has compounded across every single particle accelerator that's ever been built, and so we're just getting the same garbage out in every condition, and that's why it's so reproducible. Okay, that's possible. Right? That would be the kind of paradigm shift that I feel Thomas Kuhn talks about, where everybody all of a sudden one day is just, this is not how this works anymore. We have realized something. We ratchet forward to the next step. But if that's not the case, and if the particle accelerators are measuring something that is accurate, then we're still left with the question of, well, what the hell's down there? That's what Shiloh's pointing to, right?
Yeah, it just seems like this enormous landscape of development and progress that has nothing to do with refining the mathematics or empirical precision or anything like that.
which is why the philosophy is so important at this point, because it's the philosophical approach of what are the accurate stories that we can tell that are enlightening and useful. And that's not really a scientific question. I think that's a philosophical one. And so why when we keep getting batted from physics to philosophy to physics to philosophy, I think it's because we're not talking about building a new detector that will predict some new piece of the particle physics model. We're saying, why does smashing things together give you the measurements that you see? What is it that's down there that does that? And I guess if you're an anti-realist, then it seems a little bit like, why bother? Who cares? Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so one reason why you might bother is because telling these sorts of stories where you try to come up with some kind of intelligible theory of what's actually going on, like that theory might then lead us to think that, oh yeah, there is some error in these particle accelerators in such a way that actually they've been giving us faulty results, and then you develop new technologies. I mean, ultimately, though, I think that there is a sense in which the anti-realist just kind of has to admit that what you get with realism, I think, is there's a really nice article by someone called Alison Gopnik called "Explanation as Orgasm," and I forget the exact details of this, but basically the idea is that when you have a satisfying explanation, it's like an orgasm, right? Like it's like a little intellectual orgasm. So what you don't get that with anti-realism, right? You definitely aren't going to get like a kind of satisfying picture of how the world works, because ultimately any explanation of what the phenomena are doing from an anti-realist point of view is going to be, maybe a useful tool, but not something that we should take seriously as describing reality. But I mean, I do think one thing that I would wonder about with this connection that you're drawing between the kind of theories of what's happening on the underlying level and then the technologies that we're producing. I don't know. I mean, but so my inclination is to think that in at least some context there might be less of a connection between the theories and the instruments than there at first seems to be. So there's a really nice book by Harry Collins called Changing Order, and he describes he was he was working as a sociologist, investigating a load of people who were scientists who were trying to construct a particular kind of laser, and there was one research team that had successfully constructed this type of laser, and then a bunch of other research teams were trying to build their own lasers. And these other research teams had a very detailed theoretical model of, what was going on, like of how the laser functioned. But they were unable to successfully build their own lasers on the basis of this theoretical model. And I mean, ultimately, some of them were successful in building these lasers, but it was always things like, they'd have these stories where they say, well, we would build the laser on the basis of this model and it wouldn't work, right? And then you start like tinkering with it. And, maybe, for instance, you have to like put a book on the top of one part of the laser and like then it starts working, right? Or like maybe, you have to like slightly change the length of the wires in a particular way, or like put this wire here. So we have this model which is based on these successful theories, but even on the basis of that model we still can't actually build the laser, and instead it's just going to involve this like trial and error tinkering, and so I don't know, I mean that seems like more in line with a kind of anti-realist perspective, that ultimately the success of these things is not just coming from like, oh well, we found the truth. It's very often going to be just things like, well, you kind of have to just tinker, right? Trial and error with some stuff.
Yeah, and I think that underpins a huge portion of the misunderstanding about the connection between science and engineering, because a lot of people are like, wow, understanding the atom allowed us to develop nuclear power and atomic weapons and all of this. And it's like, if you really go and look at the history of the development of those things, it's a lot of what you just said. It's like, let's try this, let's try that, let's try this. And yes, there's some like foundational understanding, but it's not like they're just like doing some calculations and then like building the bomb and putting it out there. There's so much tinkering involved. And I think it can be kind of disheartening for students of science too, who show up thinking that they're going to like have some big theoretical breakthrough and implement it. And in reality, you're just spending all this time with a screwdriver underneath the optical platform trying to get your experiment to run properly.
I just also think that it reaches into this confusion about science and technology. This pains me to say it, but I don't think that science is very useful. And I think that we make a mistake of treating it as a useful discipline, because I think that in its purest form, it is storytelling. And so it is only as useful as
curiosity-driven
storytelling. So it can only be as useful as a story can be useful, right? Because you're exactly right that at the end of the day, you both are, that you're going to figure it out by just trial and erroring it. Not necessarily because you have the right theory, because as we've covered already, most of your theories are wrong when it gets to the specifics.
And then it becomes a question of who's it useful to, right? Because you have the production of scientific narratives and they're used for political ends, right?
And this gets me somewhere where I want to talk to, which is conspiracies and knowledge and science and how this all mixes together. There's not a deep. I think you were going in that direction already.
Well, yeah, like for instance, the COVID fiasco. Very quickly after the whole thing sprang loose, there was a pretty high impact paper that announced that this is from some animal in the jungle, blah blah blah. And if you look at like the people who were enlisted to write that paper and who they were enlisted by, like it was generally driven by people who were probably pretty embarrassed that they had this laboratory going where they were making super vicious monster viruses, and maybe one got out of the tank or something, and oh crap, like we need to tell this other story. And the story that they told it in a Nature piece very early on. I think it was in like
It's
May.
called Proximal Origins of
very,
COVID-19.
very early. And the story is plausible, it could be true, it works, but like the certainty with which that narrative is delivered, and then reinforced by the idea that science is this trustworthy thing, like you should believe in it because it's scientific, overlooks the multiplicity problem where, hey, you can actually tell, I can lay a bunch of evidence on the table at a courtroom and tell like 5 different stories about who killed who, but only one of them is true at the end of the day. And so I just fear that science got a really bad name during that fiasco because it's not this monolithic system where some narrative is absolutely true. It's just that we have evidence, we can describe it with equations, but ultimately this interpretive level is where things can kind of go off the rails for people.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that. This is the like very, very quickly, very early on. There was an attempt to just shut down the idea that it could have been like a lab leak. I mean, I don't know how much of that should okay, this is a really tricky question, right? Like, how much of this do we kind of lay at the feet of science, right? How much of this is going to be blamed on science? It's pretty clear that there can be circumstances where there are just external influences on the scientific process where you wouldn't say that like science has gone wrong. It's that the sort of conditions for appropriately flourishing science were just not in place. So something like the Lysenko affair in the Soviet Union, where they just basically shut down study of Darwinian natural selection and Mendelian genetics. like, okay, that wasn't scientists, right? Like that was the Soviet government. Now, in the case of something like the COVID lab leak, I mean, I'm not sure like how much of the suppression of the lab leak was due to scientific institutions and like problems within those institutions, or whether it was due to these kind of external forces that were like shutting down or suppressing possibilities for research. I'm not sure. So I mean, I do think it does seem to be pretty clear that like there's a sort of ideal that we have of science where like the ideal is going to be that first of all, we are open in principle to like any theory that can be empirically tested, right? Like as long as we can empirically test something, like you have to state your hypothesis, make it precise, derive some predictions. We're going to be open to that, and then we have these processes in place which will kind of remove the bias of any particular scientist. So obviously individuals are going to have all sorts of biases and blind spots, but we have processes like peer review, for example. Whenever you write a scientific paper, it's going to be criticized by other experts in the field, and so by having that sort of process go on, you're going to remove the problems that emerge because of biases. And then obviously once a paper is published, anybody can criticize it. The data should be made available to everybody, etc. So that's
but at the same time, you're introducing the biases of the people who are reviewing the paper, right?
Exactly.
It's a terrible catch-22.
Yes.
We're actually meeting with a guy tomorrow whose entire platform is based on reimagining peer review because of this central issue, where you're selecting for a set of ideas initially. And I don't know if you saw this. There was a recent Nature paper, I think it was Nature Science, that said, the rate of disruptive science is slowing down significantly.
Yes,
the ability for us to actually reassess fundamental ideas. And is that because, like you said, we've kind of reached this point where we actually understand things better than ever, or is it because we've backed ourselves into a corner where we can't really change our mind about things because those pipelines are locked down by the people who are the experts?
Yeah, I mean, in the past, science was conducted by eccentric weirdos who were very often just kind of acting independently. Maybe they were, funded by, rich patrons who were supporting their research. But like, you look at science in the sort of 1800s, right? That's very often how it was. It was just kind of like almost these like gentleman amateurs. And there have been lots of good things that have, so the changes that have happened in science and society since the 1700s, there's obviously a lot of good things about that. But I do wonder whether, one of the things that has happened since all of this has become institutionalized and since we have like big science, right? Well, these days, it seems to be driven by like whole research teams, and like networking is a big part of it. If you want to get anywhere in academia, you really have to be good at networking, and that means you can't be too disruptive. You can't make big waves. You don't want to piss off the wrong people. Sorry, I'm not sure if I should be using bad language. I don't.
Yeah, use it up.
Okay. But anyway, so it's maybe become like much more conservative, and obviously one of the consequences of this is, well, it's not clear that we're going to be like, even if we could in principle have this sort of disruptive research, maybe it's more difficult to get that now because of these changing social factors. And moreover, it means that kind of ideal picture of science that I was presenting a minute ago, that sort of optimistic picture where we just have this kind of battle between all sorts of different ideas, and everybody's ideas are treated equally, etc. That's not really so true. There are all sorts of there's all sorts of biases and limitations, and like I think it's very difficult for somebody who's a layperson. It's very difficult to justify like why they should just trust this institution. And I mean, ultimately, we do grant science with a great deal of power. It has a lot of political power. It has a great deal of influence on technology and so on. And explaining to somebody who's like not part of academia, okay, why should you trust these experts rather than I don't know, the sort of what we might think of as crazy conspiracy theorists. I don't know. That's a very hard question to answer, I think.
Yeah, and it seems like it's like a huge threat to the epistemological validity of the practice itself, because you cannot separate science in the institutional sense from state crafting. And I think the COVID epidemic was a great example of this, where, we had the luxury of reading all of the scientific literatures that came out. It was not congruent with what was being messaged by the state. In fact, it was in stark contrast to it in many senses. And so on one hand, you have the state people standing up saying, this is what the science says, believe the science. And you have the scientists very meekly in the background, just, making very careful statements, like, don't take my funding, sir, but I don't think PCR is perhaps a very good test for this. And they're like, shut up, like, PCR is great. We got a great contract with these PCR people, leave us alone. And so I was very, very sad to see this, because I thought, oh my God, this is going to give science as a whole a terrible name, even though what's going on at this messaging level has nothing to do, very little to do with science whatsoever. And I think that in so much as we've entrusted our scientific epistemology to the state, we run the risk of suffering all of the political motivations of that state. And yes. With increasingly, corporatist capture of our state infrastructure, it seems like we're getting even further and further away from anything that can possibly tell us about the truth, because it can really only tell us about what's funded to be a potential solution to the truth.
And I think that what is at the heart of climate skepticism is that this same sort of messaging takeover appears to be happening there as well. Where you have, so what was the crazy thing that happened during COVID was a leveraging of compassion. You have to do these things in order to care for other people. And when you're like, hold on a second, hold on, that doesn't make any sense. People are like, what, you don't care about other people? And then you have to justify why it is that you do care about other people, or you sound like a psychopath. And it's a very, very efficient way of basically getting you to shut up and to get in line and to do what you're expected to do. Okay. Now we have climate. Climate is, in some sense, being leveraged by the same top-down infrastructural systems to, again, leverage people's compassion, except this time about the planet rather than about their neighbors, to motivate behavior. And so I think that what people are very skeptical about is they're skeptical about the systems that are pressing on them and are debating whether or not it's actually getting hotter, because what they're really debating is they're debating the way that science is used as a cudgel to get people to do stuff on the back of a compassion-based narrative. Mm-hmm. And I also have a tendency of thinking that there's a lot of financial stuff that's folded into climate that allows us to think about carbon neutrality and getting rid of carbon in the atmosphere, which is a very easy and cheap thing to do, and to just continue doing everything the way that we've been doing all along. But doing something like getting rid of plastics, making sure that there's not huge amounts of fertilizer runoffs from fields, making sure that the bug populations are high, answering the question of why does everybody...
What happened to all the fish?
Well, I mean, people eat a lot of fish, but also, what are the consequences of pouring chemicals on our landscapes everywhere where we live that are killing the fish, right? Because right now the narrative is all the fish are gone because we ate all the fish. And it's like, well, pesticides are orders of magnitude more poisonous to fish than they are to humans.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like the way that these things build up in the environment are obvious and they're very, very, very difficult to mitigate. But it's much easier to say, it's getting hotter, we have to mitigate carbon dioxide, and then we're going to save the world.
Of course, I mean, some of those changes are going to just be like easier in practice, right? So, in the case of like climate change, it seems to be the case that there's a relatively simple knob we can twiddle to make a difference there. And,
is it the right knob, though?
Well,
is it the most effective knob? Right?
That's why I say it seems to be the case. But
right, and I think
that's kind of what happened with COVID too. Is I spent a number of years working around immunologists and virologists before I got into physics, and anybody who was working in those fields was patently aware of the fact that making a vaccine for a fast mutating respiratory virus is a wonderful, cute idea, but it doesn't work. And so when we started seeing these headlines, like the way we're going to solve this problem and the way we're going to open up society is by making a vaccine that solves this problem. There was a lot of people in the scientific community who were like, what the hell are they talking about? That's a ridiculous thing to promise people. We've never succeeded in doing that before. What's going on here? And so there's this weird cognitive dissonance that starts to pop up where you find yourself getting thrown in with conspiracy theorists and every variety of lunatic imaginable just because something, the state narrative that is getting funded by the science is starting to depart from what you see your job as a true scientist looking for how things actually work in the world. And it's very terrifying.
There's kind of like the two serious problems here then. So there's one issue which is, well, why exactly should, if I'm a layperson and I'm not myself personally involved in academia or I don't have any involvement in science, right? Like, why should I trust these experts, right? Like the scientific experts. But actually, I think we're now like running into a second issue, which is, well, how do I, as a layperson, figure out what it is that the experts are even saying? So I feel like with like this kind of COVID stuff, in order to really know that there was like that the experts in immunology had the kind of more careful view that you're describing, you would already have to have like a pretty good understanding of immunology. You'd have to be kind of keeping up with,
for sure,
with what it is. And of course, a lot of people don't have time to do that, right? Like they have other things going on in their lives. You can't keep up with everything that's going on in the world. And so like on the one hand, there's this problem of, well, okay, why should I trust the scientific experts? But then even if I do trust the scientific experts, how do I even figure out what it is that the scientific experts are saying? So like I'm pretty confident that the majority of people who are climate scientists are in favor of the view that burning fossil fuels contributes to climate change, and that's going to have various negative effects. But with respect to, what would be the most efficient way of dealing with that problem? I don't know. I mean, now it starts to become a lot less clear. Like, what do the scientific experts actually recommend? I feel like you probably have to have a much kind of deeper interaction with that particular community in order to have a good view about that.
Well, I feel like the problem starts even earlier than that, because it's like, well, yeah, burning stuff in your car is a bad idea. I completely agree. But I think that it's a bad idea for a lot of reasons that aren't even being talked about. I think that there's chemicals coming out of those combustion reactions. There's stuff coming off the car tires. There's stuff coming off the brake pads that are absolutely, heinous for our health. But they're not part of the discussion anymore.
Because you can't get rid of them.
You can't easily get rid of them. Like, it's super easy to make a carbon scrubber, to levy carbon taxes. It's a very easily remediated problem. And so it gets a lot of attention. But it in the process of getting all that attention, it sucks up all the attention from all of the other issues, which, in my opinion, are probably at least equally as great a concern.
My mindset about this is totally in line with yours, which is that there's other stuff that's a greater concern. I'm not 100% certain that CO2 is dangerous or is bad. Like we've talked to a lot of people who make really compelling cases for there to not be a one-to-one relationship between carbon dioxide and the atmosphere and temperature. They also make compelling cases about the fact that carbon has been much, much higher in the past. Like, there's just like all this stuff that you can go down the road where you can look at those arguments and you can be like, that's interesting. Like there are solid scientific arguments that tell a different story. I think that the other question that's much more interesting to me is how climate is a scissor statement in society, where you have people that fall on opposite sides of it so completely and so fully that they're able to form their identities around it. It is an identitarian organizing point, and what I'm curious about is how do we disarm both of those sides so that they can speak to each other and actually address what is relevant and useful. Because on the underlying basement of all of it, I see both sides as having good points. The side that's like, hey, this carbon dioxide stuff is nonsensical and it is a huge new world order conspiracy. And like, that's probably taking it a little far, but it is an enormous money-making industry. There are a lot of incentives that push people towards it. And the complaint that people have, which is that transitioning from combustion engines to batteries is going to be very expensive. And it's going to be built on the back of Congolese slave children. And so you've lessened your carbon dioxide footprint, but you've directly increased your Congolese slave footprint. And it's like, which is better? The people who are against the idea of eradicating CO2 and moving everything to electric harness the standpoint that perhaps it's not better to maximize your slave labor impact. Okay, fine. The people who are on the other side are looking at the dead oceans, and they're looking at the dead forests, and they're looking at the massive fires, and they're saying, hey, we have to do something. And I think that the job of somebody who is a generalist is to look at both of those positions and to figure out, okay, what are the most vital pieces of all of those positions? And how do we synthesize them into something that a greater number of people can get behind because they're the reasonable ones that don't actually want the extremist standpoint. And that middle ground is almost completely gone because there's a huge push to either talk about the conspiracy or talk about how there's no conspiracy. And there's no exploration of the middle, which is like, well, there's probably a more nuanced and more effective way of looking at this that takes into account all the different pieces. And I wonder if that's not what philosophy is for.
Well, probably that is a role that philosophers can play. Of course, philosophers could also, argue for either of those extreme views as well. Philosophers argue for everything, so there's not going to be any consensus on any sort of middle path. I do wonder, though, in this particular case, given the sorts of views that people have and the kind of backgrounds that they're coming from, it's kind of hard for me to make the claim that they ought to be trying to find a compromise, because ultimately, if you think that climate change really is potentially catastrophic, then you can't compromise on that. If you believe that climate change is something that could result in the collapse of civilization or something like that, then I don't know, where can the compromise be from your point of view?
Well, the compromise from that point of view is the fact that climate has probably ended every single civilization. And so the goal is to find a civilization that is resilient to a climate change event. Because that's what has destroyed basically every single civilization that has ever.
That and violent arguing about about things like climate change.
Right, because I mean, look, if you're like, look, climate change has destroyed every single civilization, and what we should do is we should throw more virgins in the volcano, your civilization is going to die from climate change. And so if you make that mistake, if your goal is really to look at it and you're like, I want to preserve this civilization because it's really good, it's really fucking good, and I really fucking like it. And the argument can be made that it is. The argument can be made, the fact that we can do this right now, the fact that I can walk down the street and not have 10 children with me, 5 of whom died before the age of 2. Like, it's hard for me to look at the world that we live in right now and for all of its problems to not be like, hey, there's enough here that's worth preserving, because if we let it fall apart, we're going to go back to the Stone Ages and we're going to have to scrabble our way back. And that means that we have to get all the way back to the Enlightenment again. And that seems like a really long and unpleasant road. Okay, so we want to keep what we have as much as we can. That means that we have to know that the solutions that we're implementing are the right ones. And so the people that care most about climate change should be the ones that care most about making sure that they're implementing the right solutions. And that's, I think, where we have to start from.
Sure. I mean, I mean, this is where, like, okay, the background assumptions that you're making about like what the source of these problems is going to come into play. Because if you think climate change is just a product of burning fossil fuels, then, I mean, again, you can twiddle that knob relatively easily. Well, you can't do it easily, but it's simple. It's not easy, but it is simple. Like, the answer is very simple. Just stop burning so many fossil fuels. On the other hand, if, like, I don't know, because of maybe climate change is going to cause desertification and, we're not going to be able to grow crops so easily. Okay, well, how do we like twiddle the knobs so that we're able to grow as many crops as we are growing today, right, under these different conditions? That's a lot more tricky to even figure out what the answer is. There are probably things we could do. I mean, you can genetically modify things, but then that has, like, there are costs to the sorts of solutions that we might want to implement there. So, yeah, I mean, this is just where I'm sort of thinking that, like, there might just be a kind of, in principle, like, block to kind of finding a sort of compromise. I mean, for what it's worth, I'm very much in favor of. I mean, like, I think that my view would be, I think we probably should do something about climate change. But it seems to me that that's because, well, I don't think the cost. So I think that, the cost of, like, transitioning away from fossil fuels seems like it would be offset if we were to come up with, green technologies. Like, it seems like that would be a good idea, to invest in, like, sustainable technologies, right? New technologies. That seems to be something, like, if you think about, well, what's responsible for all of the good things about civilization? It seems like that's come from the development of new technologies, or at least a lot of that stuff has. So, like, if we think that technological development is a good thing, then, yeah, we can look at something like, burning fossil fuels and think, okay, maybe it's worth investigating other technologies. Not least because even if you ignore climate change, there's a limited amount of fossil fuels. So sooner or later, we're going to have to deal with that problem anyway. So, we might as well deal with it now. I don't know. I guess that would be the sort of line that I would suggest.
I think it's interesting because I remember we had the director of the Canadian Fisheries Department on the show a really long time ago, Daniel Pauly. And we talked to him about this, and obviously he's like a government official, and so he's very much in line with the story of CO2 as the most important marker. And over the course of the conversation, it became clear that his perspective was that it wasn't the most important marker, but that it was the most likely marker
to rally support behind.
And once we could pull on the lever of CO2, then we would be sufficiently organized to pull on all the other levels that would then need to be pulled on in order to actually make this work. And so I think that there's a certain degree of people who see through that narrative compromise. And I think a much greater coalition could be built if we could just go to those people and be like, look, you're right. There is a narrative compromise that we're making here. And we need to be able to move in this direction. And so if you have a better narrative compromise that we can make in order to get people together to actually make something good happen, then fine. But I don't know. I'm not optimistic about it happening. But perhaps we can meet again down the line and see if we can get any closer to it.
No, I'm not particularly optimistic about about the future in that respect either. So you know.
It's been a really fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate that you've entertained our perhaps out there perspectives on philosophy.
No, well, thank you very much. I enjoyed that. Yeah, that was really good. Thanks for having me on.
Do you have any closing words of wisdom about epistemology, or how we should approach our epistemology in the future?
Oh, I don't think so, really. No, not really. I really wish I could have some sort of punchy summary, but sorry.
All right. Well, you got plenty of videos on your channel. People can definitely go over and check those out.
The truth is that my conclusion from everything that I've thought about with respect to epistemology is that it just turns out that I at least don't really know anything at all, and I'm fairly confident that that's true for other people as well. But I'm not willing to say that I know that that's the case. So I find myself when I think about all of the different alternative perspectives and how plausible some of them are, I find myself running into a bit of a fog, and that's where I am at the moment.
I think that that's where we like to spend a lot of time. And so I think that it is a marked success of the conversation that we've all reached that place, because that fog of possibilities, I think, where the interesting ideas come from. And so I hope it's not too disorienting.
Okay.
And then you are Kane B on YouTube, right?
Yep, that's right. If you type in Kane B or Kane Baker philosophy on YouTube, you'll be able to find me. And I've got a bunch of philosophy videos. So that's
nice.
me.
Do you do any social media or anything like that if people want to chat with you?
People can chat with me. I mean, I have my email available, so you can send me an email. I have a Discord server. I did have a Twitter, but I stopped using it because it seemed like Twitter is not going to be as popular as it once was. And I couldn't really be bothered to continue putting work into maintaining a Twitter account if nobody's going to be using it anymore. So I sort of just drifted away from that. So that's, I don't really have a lot of social media, but people can still find me.
Excellent.
Right on. Well, yeah, thank you for spending the afternoon with us. It's been given me a lot to think about. So I'm going to wander around and think about these ideas for the rest of the day. Maybe I'll come up with something. Bring it into the next conversation.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Have a
great rest of your day.
Okay. Bye.
Bye, everybody.